Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlow, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome to Strength Chat with your host, the mad scientist of strength, Chris Duffin. To my right, our master athlete and coach, Dr. Rudolph.
Why do you always chuckle before you say that?
I don't know.
You kind of forgot what my name was there for a second.
I always screw up the intro in one way or another.
Is there a master six category?
And to the left, the wizard of training, Brandon Sen. So today, we're really excited to have on Christian Bosa. Did I get that right, Christian?
Good.
Okay, it's acceptable. So Christian is a high-level strength and conditioning coach that works with a number of different Olympic-level athletes from several different countries, including we've got Spain, England, India, China, the Netherlands, and like I said, a lot of different sports. You started with tennis, is that correct?
That is correct.
So, Christian, let's just start off and get a little introduction to our audience about your background and how you got to where you're at now.
Yeah, so first and foremost, thanks for having me. I've listened to all your podcasts and I really like it. So it's an honor for me to be here. Thanks a lot, guys. An introduction. I got interested. I've always been interested in sports. Coming from Germany, you probably can hear that from my accent. But,
It's excellent.
Coming from Germany, I've been interested in football, soccer, you call it soccer, football, and tennis when I was a young kid. Later, once I was 16, 17, I got interested in lifting weights, mainly for the reason of looking a bit better. But
I think that's how we all kind of get started, honestly, in lifting weights.
And that's why we keep going.
I guess so. But then I didn't have the results I wanted to see, so I got a little bit deeper into it, thinking, okay, are there any methods or principles that are going through training? And so that's how my interest started. And when I finished school, I decided to learn more about training and decided to study sports sciences. I studied in Berlin, in Germany, in Madrid, Spain, and in Cologne, Germany. And when I finished my studies, I got the opportunity to work in a professional tennis academy in India as a S&C coach, fitness coach, it was called.
Hey, Christian, can I stop you for a second? Can you,
yes.
With your microphone rattling on your cuff there, it's making a little bit of, there, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So I started out the first 2 years of my career in India in a professional tennis academy. From there, I went to Spain to work in the tennis federation, in the Catalan Tennis Federation. So that's the province of Catalonia. I did that for 1.5 years. Then I got an offer to work for the English Tennis Federation. I went to England. After that, I went to China for the Chinese Tennis Federation. So, and that was all tennis. And then the opportunity came up here in the Netherlands to work with the Olympic Committee of the Netherlands. And I thought it was a really nice challenge to change from tennis into Olympic sports. And that's what I'm doing since 2010. So since 6-7 years, I'm here in the Netherlands, working with different sports, Olympic sports. I've worked with BMX, beach volleyball, track cycling, equestrian, and shooting. And the main focus for the Olympic Games in Rio was the BMX and the track cycling. And that's the same focus now for the next Olympic cycle.
So in your tennis expeditions throughout several countries, in working with those federations, you were a tennis player as a youth, as you say. Were you working on strength and conditioning with the different federations, or were you actually working on stroke technique or game strategy, or what was the emphasis?
Yeah, that's a good question. To clarify that, I was the strength and conditioning coach.
Right.
So, but having the background from tennis, it did help me in a lot of on-court sessions, tennis sessions. But my main responsibilities were the strength and conditioning.
Yeah, that background certainly got to help when you're actually understanding the application and be able to know, what you're doing in the strength and conditioning world and how that's going to play a role into that sport. So, you've definitely got to understand that, and I'm sure you do as you've moved into other sports, had to spend some time, understanding that sport and how does your S&C program fit into that, correct?
Yeah, definitely. And I think where I was very fortunate in tennis, I worked with a few coaches that were very, very focused on technique and understanding movement. And I think that has helped me a lot also in my strength and conditioning. I think we will talk about that a bit at a later point. But really looking at proper movement mechanics and trying to understand movement has helped me quite a bit in coaching my athletes when we're talking about squatting mechanics or the mechanics of an Olympic lift. Again, I think it's a few principles that underpin movements, but once you understand these principles, then everything becomes much easier.
Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit, because obviously that's something we're very passionate about here, is proper movement principles, and we've seen, in our take, so much a gap oftentimes between the strength and conditioning world and the sports world. In understanding that or implementing those correctly so that we've got good carryover, we don't injure our athletes, that sort of stuff. So what are some of those principles that you've seen or try to implement in regards to proper movement mechanics and what you've learned working with those sports?
Yeah, so one thing that just comes to my mind now that you mentioned that is with coaches, they always look at very specific movement patterns for the sport. But if you really break it down, then these movements can be broken down into very simple movements. There's always some squatting, some pushing, some pulling, landing, extending. So, and this is also how I look at my movements. So, for example, if I look at an Olympic lift, I mean, the power clean for me, as I'm just using the power clean as an example, the power clean we don't do for the sake of doing power cleans. But for example, we want to work on a very powerful triple extension. For example, in sports where triple extension of knees, hips, and ankles is required. Mm-hmm. Or also in a sport where you have to learn to absorb landing. So the catching phase of a power clean is also essentially the landing movement. So that is very interesting for sports like volleyball and beach volleyball. Even though for the sports coaches, it doesn't look really specific, but actually it is, because it teaches you how to absorb forces and how to land.
Absolutely.
You mentioned BMX. I would think that would be important there too. The landing.
Absolutely. In BMX, it's the landing is pretty important. Also the jumping, but also the landing. And what we've seen, especially in the lead up to the Olympic Games in London, we saw that the best riders in BMX were the ones that could land efficiently and accelerate out of the landing. So the better you can absorb the forces in a landing, the quicker you are able to re-accelerate out of that landing movement. And there's exactly where understanding the mechanics and implementing the mechanics in the training comes in.
Yeah, you've worked with a wide variety of sporting disciplines, from you mentioned equestrian, shooting, BMX, soccer, tennis. I'm sure the list goes on past that, even previous to your coaching of those really high-level athletes. What are some of the commonalities that you find in the strength and conditioning practices of those? Because, if our listeners especially are, they're probably asking themselves right now, what could a strength coach possibly do for a BMX rider, or what can a strength coach possibly do for an equestrian, maybe trainer? I don't know the exact word for an equestrianist. I don't know.
That's outside of our scope.
Yeah, that's
rider.
We use barbells, not horses. So, but what are some of the commonalities between those sporting disciplines? We talked a lot about human movement, but what are some of the commonalities you find in preparing those athletes for their sports?
Yeah. So very generally speaking, the guidelines and principles of strength and conditioning, in my opinion, are enhancing performance is number one, and preventing injuries. So making sure that the athletes have a long career. So if we're talking about sports like equestrian and shooting, the strength training doesn't contribute that much to the performance. But what it does is it gives a more robust body that you can perform your sport for a longer period of time. Especially if we're looking at equestrian, something like strength training or physical training is not really heard of. So once we started with that, we saw also that the athlete that committed to the strength training, less back pain, less niggles here, less niggles there. So they were able to perform their sport longer within a week, for example, because they ride horses for hours throughout the week. So the better the body is prepared for that, the more they can ride within a week, and the quality of the riding is higher. So this is things we see I saw with the equestrian. If I look at the other sports, like let's say tennis, BMX, beach volleyball, track cycling, football, everywhere where you need to apply power, this is where, in my opinion, strength training plays a huge role, because power simply is force multiplied by velocity. So the more force you have, potentially the more force you can apply. I know there is always that argument, we know there are people that are very, very forceful but can't produce a lot of power. That is true, but that's why you don't only train force development via maximum strength training. You also work on power development via plyometrics, ballistic exercises, whatever. So this is where I see the strength and conditioning has a big role, or especially the strength training has a big role across all sports.
Yeah, I think the underlying concept there is you're making the athletes better at their sport, not necessarily the things that are happening in the gym. Another interesting topic, a lot of these sports you mentioned are really cyclic. So I'm not an expert, like I said, in equestrian shooting and other Olympic disciplines, but I imagine the Olympic Games is the biggest stage for those sports. So what does your preparation look like for those sports? Or you can even, I know we talked about a lot of varying sports, you don't have to name them all, but what does the preparation look like, leading between those 4-year spans of Olympic Games? Are there, I imagine there's bigger competitions along the way, but what approach do you take to long-term development of those athletes in the Olympic Games?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, I like to work on principles. So one principle I like to work on is starting with the end in mind. So if we are looking at the Olympic Games at one moment in time, and I have 4 years, then the macro plan is made for 4 years. And then these 4 years are broken down into 4 times 1 year. And then each individual year is further broken down. So this is a very rough outline how the process works. And then, if we look at the year, we look at the competition schedule and identify the most important competitions. And then we look at how much time do we have in between these competitions. And then in communication with the coach, we kind of decide which are periods where we focus mainly on the physical development and when are periods where we mainly focus on the sports performance. And then the physical development takes a little bit of a backseat where we're more working towards maintaining what we have built to be able to go full out in the next period where the focus again is on physical development.
How frequently are these cyclic sporting disciplines actually competing? What do you think, in your experience, has the average competition frequency outside of an Olympic cycle for these athletes?
Sorry, can you rephrase that again?
So there's several. I mean, there's every year. I'm sure there's the Pan Am Games. There's the World Championships in just about all of those sports, and there's a circuit of competitions worldwide for all of those sports.
Yeah. I think it depends very much on the sport. So if we take an example like tennis or football, soccer, they have a very, very long competitive year. So very short off season. So that's very difficult to make a big impact in the off season. It's more about how do you manage the in season and really find moments where you can apply some proper training that leads to adaptations. With the sports like BMX and track cycling that I've mainly worked with, we have a bit of a longer off-season where we can make sure that we develop the necessary qualities, physical qualities we want to see in the season.
Are you doing most of this like hands-on, or do you do some of this as remote and just as a planning for your clients, or what does that look like? Just wondering because of the broad base of people that you're working with and sports that you're working with.
Yeah, so with my main responsibilities here at the Olympic Committee, it's mainly hands-on. So I see the athletes 3-4 times a week, and I'm responsible for writing the programs as well as the delivery. For smaller programs, there it's also remote coaching. So I write the programs, and then in communication with the coach, I kind of explain what needs to be done, but I'm not present in all of the sessions. And the same is true. I still have some of my old tennis players that I'm supporting. There it's just I write a program, explain them over the phone what needs to be done, but I hardly see them.
I imagine
so it's a mix of everything.
I imagine your relationship with the sport performance coach on each of those is pretty important in, getting adherence.
That's the make or break it criteria, in my opinion. I think the programs where we have been successful at the last Olympic Games, like BMX and track cycling, we have a very, very good communication as well as a common philosophy. And I've been working with coaches where we did not have a common philosophy, and that has always been difficult. Because as an SMC coach, the sports coach is running the program. That is, I think, something that is very important for every SNC coach to understand. So the sports coach runs the program. So you as an SNC coach have to adapt to their philosophy. And that can be challenging, especially if you are asked to do something which is literally, how to phrase that carefully, which is literally against what you believe and what you think is best practices.
Yeah. What do you do when you encounter that type of situation?
Yeah, let me give you a specific example. I was working with, let's call it martial arts sports, and they are very much used to training their athletes into the ground every single time. So which is very different to my approach. I really like to have proper planning, looking at intensities and volumes, so very mathematical. But yeah,
we're behind. We're behind you.
Yeah, I believe that. But again, so then, yeah, it requires a lot of talking. It requires also kind of upskilling the coach in terms of what is deload week and why do we need loading and unloading and these kind of things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. I have to be honest here. It hasn't worked all the time. Yep.
What are some of the tools that you use to manage those training variables among a diverse population of sporting disciplines? I imagine the training volume that goes into a BMX athlete is much different than what we would consider training volume for the equestrian athlete or the shooting. What are some of the tools that you use to manage those variables?
Excel sheets. You can manage a lot via Excel sheets.
So in the because we have pretty extensive Excel sheets too that do a lot. Luckily, our sport is very simple. It's a barbell. You got to lift the barbell heavier. Yeah. We lift heavier barbells to lift heavier barbells. In the preparation of the BMX or whatever discipline you have, because we can consider volume in many different ways. Do you consider volume in a discipline of strictly barbell loaded or dumbbell loaded or resistance loaded? Do you consider volume in terms of the overall time spent training in the weight room? What are some different things you look at specifically from a coaching standpoint, or is it different for each sport?
It is definitely different for each sport. So if we're talking about shooting and equestrian, then it comes down to hours. So looking at the hours of training, how many hours of training do they do in their sport and how many hours of training do they do with me? If it comes to BMX, then also we're looking at total hours of training per week and per month. And if I break it down into my sessions, the strength and conditioning, I look at volumes in terms of total number of repetitions, as well as the load, kind of looking at volume multiplied by intensities or volume multiplied by load lifted. So volume load as expressed as tonnage, so in kilograms, or volume load as a number of volume multiplied by average intensity.
Have you found any, going beyond that, have you found anything with your data collection in terms of predictive modeling for your athletes, in terms of, we notice that injury rates tend to increase when this particular group of athletes reach this volume level or this stress level? Have you found any use in the highest, arguably the highest level of strength and conditioning coaching of predictive models?
It's a work in progress. It's a work in progress because every athlete responds differently. Plus, that gets a little bit away from that. There's always we have the volumes and intensities that we can measure really in a number, but then also sometimes you need to consider the personality of an athlete. Some athletes respond better to stress, whether it's training stress or private stress, than others. So the modeling can help, but it's an art and a science. I have to say that when I started out in my career, I was under the belief that everything can be modeled and monitored. But I think I learned along the way that the art can sometimes be bigger than the science.
Yeah, and that's definitely the coaching side of what you do. That's the coaching side of strength and conditioning.
Yeah, you touched on something that I've been thinking about as you've been talking all along. It's fairly easy for us to motivate power lifters or weightlifters to move a bar and to understand load and intensity and repetitions, etc. But how do you motivate a beach volleyball player to lift weights, or a BMX or an equestrian? I mean, what winds their watch? How do you get them or show them that moving more and more intense load will improve their game, which is not a barbell sport?
Yeah. If you allow me, I would go one step back, because while you were talking, something popped up in my head when I was talking about the understanding the athlete and how he deals with stress. So a specific example, in the lead up to the Olympic Games in London, with some of my athletes, I was really looking at the beginning of each session, we performed a couple of jumps, drop jumps, counter movement jumps, and we looked at contact times and we looked at flight times and all these variables with the idea behind it to determine their readiness for training. A very solid plan. But what happened is some of the athletes, after some time, they got a very good idea what a good contact time is for them and what a good flight time is. And if the flight time or contact time was lower, or let's say the result was worse than in the previous training, it had such an effect on them that the whole training kind of went down the drain.
We could
see that.
And this is what I mean with understanding mental is always a big word, but let's say understanding the mental aspect of an athlete, that the plan is solid. You want to see, okay, at this contact time he's maybe a little bit overreached or not, or maybe whatever, but the effect it had when they were jumping, and I told them, okay, this time it was just whatever contact time was 210 milliseconds instead of 180. It had such a detrimental effect on how they thought they were physically ready to train that, at some point I just left it.
Yeah, that's a very tricky thing, and we deal with that with our own athletes.
Yep.
athletes tend to see things in black and white. It's very difficult for them to see a big picture of training and how it lays out. It's very easy for them to be stuck in the day-to-day grind of training. We use velocity a lot for our athletes. All of our remote coaching athletes receive a velocity device, and we use that as one of the primary load regulators. One thing that I've personally gone back and forth on is whether or not I want to show those athletes their estimated 1 rep maxes based on velocity. You can imagine if an athlete has a pretty good, Monday squat session, they see that their estimated 1 rep max based on velocity comes out to be pretty high, maybe higher than they expected. Next week, maybe they don't notice any difference in how they feel, but their estimated 1 rep max comes out lower. It can be very damaging for a lot of athletes and have them questioning, the effectiveness of their training, or, maybe they did something wrong, or their overall progress when, that's just the natural ebb and flow of stress. So that's it's always interesting, and Rudy might even be able to chime in on this, considering his background and what his PhD is in. But there's in my opinion, there's only so much that you really want to divulge to an athlete, because they just don't know how to process all of it like you do, or they can't be objective with it.
Yes.
Well, it can work, and that's where we use subjective measures too. Oftentimes,
both.
We trick an athlete by not telling them how much weight is on the bar, because they have this mental block that I can't get over a certain weight. Yeah. But you throw the weight unbeknownst to them, and because they think it's less, they can actually achieve it. So the mind plays tricks. But getting back to that question, working with non-barbell athletes. What do you use data to show them that improved strength is going to help their landing? Do you use video after 4, 6, 8 weeks of strength training to show their improvement in their sport? Or actually, how do you keep them motivated to go to the weight room to come and see you, as opposed to hitting more forehands or more backhands, or jumping that horse over more jumps?
Yeah. The question of motivation is always a tricky one for me. I have to be honest with that. Because if a high-level athlete needs someone else to motivate them, then something's going wrong. In my opinion, I have to be very frank here, because let's face it, we are chasing their dream. And I'm supporting them in that. And I'm very, very happy if someone like one of my guys, he won the silver medal at the Olympics, or actually 2 guys won the silver medal, one lady won the gold medal. It's the biggest moment in their life, but it's also a very, very great moment in my life.
Sure.
So I think motivation has to come from the athlete, but I'm there to support. And when things don't go right, then it's definitely up to me to step in and say, listen, things don't always go right, and then I have to start motivating. How do we do it? Again, art and science. We use testing results. We have regular tests where we can see improvements, and that's dependent on the sport. If it's beach volleyball or volleyball, then definitely something like a vertical jump, counter movement jump, squat jump is very important. If it's a sport like BMX, then we look at numbers. The 1RM is very important to us. Also, if we use our power measurements on a platform, for example, we look at rate of force development. So this is something we do, and we use the data to prove how the training goes.
That's essentially what we do as well.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
We it's very easy to say, relax. You're far out from a competition. Just keep training. Things will turn around. But if you can actually back up what you're saying with some actual numbers that the athlete can relate to, because regardless of what you tell them, athletes are also very selfish in a lot of ways, and they're very concerned about their achievements, their accomplishments, and they want to know, if they're on the path to do that. So when you can actually back that up with objective data, that goes a long way in my experience.
Yeah.
Well,
I agree.
in your case, in our case, it's fairly simple because we're, it's to be objective, and we're measuring. I mean, our sport is training, but the sports that you're doing strength training on, you're trying to show results in their actual sport. So, can you use something like measuring data of the speed of their serve, their first serve, for example? So they start off, before strength training, they're hitting the ball, I don't know what it is, 100 miles an hour, but after 6 weeks of training, they're up to 103. Do you use that kind of measurement feedback in their actual sport?
Yes, we do that. But if we're talking about tennis, then it's always a bit easier to quantify the running. Let's say we can look at 5-meter sprints, 10-meter sprints, changes of directions. Hitting serve or looking at stroke velocity, it requires quite a bit of equipment, which is not accessible for everyone. Plus, the validity of this equipment is not that great. So, yes, I would answer the question with yes, but then we're looking more at sprinting times, changes of direction, these kind of things.
Sure.
You mentioned some of the technology you guys use. Where do you think the strength and conditioning industry is headed? In our sector, we've seen we've been using technology, specifically velocity, since I don't know, when did you start using it, Chris? 2008
or 9,
it's been a long time. But we've seen a real explosion recently, simply because the barrier to entry has been lowered by companies wanting to compete to get their product on the market. Where do you see technology coming in terms of things that the coach can actually use in the future? Where do you see any specific products or areas that might not be available now, but in the next 10 years, maybe everybody's using it?
I think you kind of answered the question already. I mean, we've seen the use of velocity-based training more and more now, and equipment is much more available than it used to be. We kind of see the same trend if we're looking at positional data in court sports. That has not been available for a long time, but now it also becomes more and more available for a smaller budget, let's say. And the same we see if we're looking at monitoring internal markers, right? So if you look back at devices that are able to look at heart rate variability, you see that more and more now, and you can attach it to your iPhone, and measurements can be taken within a few minutes. So, yeah, we see more and more technology coming in. I think where the main challenge lies is determining which technology is useful and which is not. Because, frankly speaking, and that's probably more one of my own principles, is like to keep things simple. And because the more you do, the more confused you can get. So really looking at what can I measure that is really meaningful, rather than measuring everything you can measure.
I think that's a really important point, Christian, and is something we have to be very wary of as we become involved more technology with training. Because, again, yeah, you've got to know, just because you can measure something and collect all this data, like, what is the point unless it's adding some value? And you've got to be very specific in how you use it and how you apply it. Like the VBT stuff that we do, we've got a very specific methodology and approach, but a lot of other people use them in a variety of different ways, and we question, like, why? It doesn't make any... Where are you going with this?
What are you controlling? What are you getting out of it?
Exactly. And, the nerdy part of us always wants to, see all that data, but unless you're, driving action, driving changes with your training plan, it's not adding value, and you're just, it's just more fluff.
Yeah, and
Must be a
arguably,
nerd.
there's definitely we want actionable data, but the technology's there, and it's nice if you can use it. But I think another huge thing that has to be considered is the integration of it. So how can we use these different pieces of technology together? Can we use these different pieces of technology together to give us one hopefully simple answer? Because we're, a lot of times we talk about velocity, we talk about data management in our own training. People think it's so complex, and maybe if you don't know what you're looking at, it can be. But ultimately, we want to streamline the process, and in the process of doing so, learn as much as we can with as few of controlling variables as possible.
We're working a little bit with the off-end gun and archery sports now with one of our devices. And as you've coached shooters, what do you see as important for them in your strength and conditioning program? Is it shoulder girdle, core? I mean, what do you emphasize?
That's a really good question.
That's my job.
Yeah. No. Good question. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think the physical preparation as such has a very limited application in terms of improving their performance. What we see with shooters is they tend to have, because they're in such a fairly strange position when they shoot, we see a lot of back problems. We see a lot of problems in the hip. So I think where the strength and conditioning training really comes in is in preventing these problems and injuries. And that's the main focus of our training, really getting them, let's use the word fit. I mean, fit is such a, let's get them fit, or let's get them ready to perform their shooting training. And so it's more kind of,
you're talking about like all those
maintaining health and
Well, you said that at
the
the outset. You said there were two principles. One was improving performance, and the other was preventing injury. So, in the case of the shooters, I guess your emphasis is more on longevity and prevention of injury.
Absolutely.
I imagine those static and odd postures they're in are what you're referring to causing some of those issues, right?
Yes. I mean, as I said, it every time I start with a new sport, and I've started fairly recently with the coaching of the shooters, I try to understand the sport as much as I can. So I went with the shooting coach into the shooting hall, and he put me in those positions. And it's really strange. You're kind of leaning backwards, and it's completely, I don't want to say it's a screwed up posture, but it is quite weird, and you can already feel the strain on your back and your hip when you're in that position. So, and that was the starting point for me to understand, okay, if this is what they need, what will that mean if they do that day in, day out, week in, week out for years? And how can we probably physically prepare them to be better in these positions?
Well, I think, and this is where Rudy's leading it. One of the things is we're working with some Olympic caliber shooters here in the U.S., and they're seeing pretty significant results from using the shoulder rock with dealing with some of that tightness and rigidity and stiffness and the integration again to the back and the hips and all that. And so that's been really interesting. Having these bow shooters and rifle shooters coming to us and starting to use that product and realizing the results from it.
So, Christian, as we kind of begin to wrap up here, you've arguably reached the highest level in strength and conditioning a coach can. You're working with Olympic athletes, and that's probably the outside of profession, being the lead strength and conditioning coach of maybe a professional sports organization. That's arguably the highest level that you can reach. What are some tips or some guidance that you can give young strength and conditioning professionals looking to get into the industry or looking to progress, hopefully to to a point that you have reached?
I think sports and career follow the same principles, right? It's kind of how much you want it. It's kind of the perseverance. If I look at my career, and I started studying, I mean, a lot of people have studied, but then it's also about making sacrifices. I went to India, which is a big step for a European to go to India and live in India. And but I always did it because I believed that is what I wanted to do, and I believed I needed to learn. And yeah, I was looking at the opportunities I can take and took them when they came up. I think a big one is continuing education, looking at getting better and better. But I think the most important one for me is there is a quote from Caesar, the Roman Caesar, who says experience is the master of everything. And I think that is really true. I think if you want to be a coach, you need to coach. And that is also, I think, how my side project started. If I'm looking at, I've put out a website a few months ago and just showing what we are doing. And it's not that we are doing very, very special things, but I think we're doing a few things, basic things, and we do them really, really well. And I think that is where the art of coaching comes in. If you want to be an S&C coach, you need to coach. And if we follow the 10,000 hour rule of achieving excellence, it's the same with coaching. It's you need to coach and you need to get the hours in a weight room, coach different athletes.
Yeah, no doubt. Arguably, some of the best coaches you never hear about because they are doing just that. They're out there coaching. We see a lot of people posting on social media, and those are typically the ones who we seek as the premier strength and conditioning coach or the premier authority. But more often than not, the actual coaches you'll never hear from because they're actually out doing the thing. So I think that's a really important topic to end on
this
today.
is one. If I'm allowed to jump in, this is also how I started my project with the website. I've been sitting in S&C conferences for ages now, and I've seen so many great presentations and talking about the stuff we talked before, monitoring and very, very sophisticated stuff. The presenters have long titles, so nothing wrong with a long title. Mm-hmm. But the moment they showed videos of their athletes, I was like, well, this is what my 15-year-old athletes can do, right? So
I believe you.
I'm not getting at any names or anything, but this is what I've seen. The presentations were so complicated to understand, but then you see a grown-up male doing walking lunges, holding a medicine ball in front and almost falling over. And then my question is what's the use of a sophisticated training program if that person is not able to do the basic movements well?
Yeah, you got to start with the fundamentals.
Absolutely. And fundamentals and do them really well and do them over and over again.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your website a little bit more. Let's get some details on that before we have to wrap up the call.
Yes. Yeah. So I had more and more requests asking what do you do with the BMX guys? What are you doing with the track cycling? So I just teamed up with someone who's good with let's put it together, looking at some keywords that you can find on the internet. And he said why don't you approach these ones? I mean, people are looking for that. People want to hear that information. They are actively seeking for that information. Why don't you put it out? So I started, and I named the website Train Like an Olympian because I just the message of my website is really what I mentioned before. We're not doing anything complicated or sophisticated. We're not using Google Glasses for training or whatever kind of gadgets are out there. We do the basics, and we do them really well. And the higher you get at the level, then we also use some stuff like you guys are doing, like velocity-based training and these kind of things. But nevertheless, until these guys get to that level, they have to put the hours in and they have to do good training of the fundamentals. And this is the point I want to hammer home, let's say, on my website. Also, what you said before, one thing I really want to get across is if people design a training program or looking at what can they do in their training, always start with the question, why? What do I want to get out of the training and what is the purpose? And I've seen so many people who kind of skip that step.
Yep,
See, what are all the training methods that are available?
A pretty common phrase in the circles of people I interact with is, the goal is the goal. So you've got to not lose sight of that, not get lost in the technology, the dogma, the whatever it is. But remember what's the goal at the end of the day. So
it's really easy to get caught up in the sexiness of training and doing the fancy exercises when, if Christian's saying that, the basics are good enough for his Olympic athletes, and I think the basics are good enough for our listeners.
Yep. Well, we'll get a link to the website, but can you, for our listeners, tell them what that website is?
Yeah, it's my name, christianbosse.com. So it's CHRISTIAN, and then Bosse, BOSSE.com.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, I think our, we've had some good discussion today, and I think our listeners will definitely, hopefully seek you out and, consume some of the more detailed information that you've put out there. So I think I speak for all of us when I say, thank you for taking the time to chat with us today, and, maybe we can further this conversation on, a future date.
Absolutely. Do you have any last words you want to throw in before we wrap up the call?
Thanks for having me, and I really like what you guys are doing, so keep it up.
Do you have any athletes that we should be keeping an eye on here that have big competitions coming up?
I mean, we're in the post-Olympic year, right? So we still have competitions coming up, but the next big one is in 2020.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, we'll schedule our next podcast for 2020. See you then.
All right, Christian. Thanks for joining us today.
All right, thanks,
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.